I'm so excited to share this book with you. This has been a book that made me think more than a lot of books that I've read recently. It's one of those ones where you come away from it with a new perspective on the world. And that was really refreshing because I feel like I haven't found a book that really did that for me in a while. And as soon as I started this, I knew that it was going to be kind of fun and thought-provoking, interesting, and it really delivered on that. So the book we're talking about today is Straw Dogs by John Gray. And I really don't think you can get through this book without deeply questioning one of your previously long-held, taken for granted beliefs. This isn't an episode where I give you some very tactical bits of information. This is an episode where I try to break your brain a little bit. And I'm excited for that because we're going to cover a lot of really fun topics in this episode. So we're going to talk about why progress is a myth. We're going to talk about why we're maybe no different from other animals, why science requires faith or is even its own form of faith, why there's no coherent self, no you, why history might be able to be better thought of as cyclical instead of linear, why we obsess over the illusion of control, why we're terrified of our own uselessness, why action and productivity are often forms of escapism, and why sometimes the solution to our biggest problems is to recognize that they aren't problems at all. As always, if you want some of my written notes that came with this episode, you can get those at natsnotes.com. Now, we'll dive in shortly. If you want to skip ahead to the first topic, please feel free to do so. I also want to share, though, why I picked this book. Straw Dogs is ultimately an attack on humanism, the belief that humans are rational, free-thinking agents who determine their future. And humanism is even a funny thing to talk about sometimes because we so often take it for granted. We just think of ourselves as people who make decisions and control our fates, and we can determine the future of our lives. But as Gray talks about in the book, there's still something lacking there because for all our supposed progress, we're not necessarily any happier. we might be living a little bit longer, there might be more of us, but have we actually solved any of those deeper human questions that we've been struggling with for all time? And to what extent is it even true that we can control our own fate, or are we just deluding ourselves? And really, a lot of it comes back to this question of how different are we really from other animals? And again, we kind of take humanism for granted. It's not something that we even question. That's why I think this book is so interesting. It's because it makes you question some of those pre-programmed beliefs that you walk around with every day that you've maybe never even looked at that closely. Even if some of these topics that I listed out seem ridiculous, give them a chance because, again, it might spark some interesting new ways for you to think about the world. Now, let's dive into the first one, this idea that progress is a myth. What Gray talks about in the book is that, yes, we make strides in technology and in medicine, but a lot of our problems remain the same and remain unsolved. Reading from the book here, progress is a fact. Even so, faith in progress is a superstition. Science enables humans to satisfy their needs. It does nothing to change them. They are no different today than from what they have always been. Now, this is just categorically true, right? This is one of my favorite things about reading old philosophy books is if you pull off one of the older books on the shelf, say like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius or Works and Days by Hesiod, you'll find that these philosophers are trying to solve a lot of the same problems that we deal with today. How do I be happy? How do I get over jealousy? How do I reasonably strive for a better future for myself and my family? And despite living in a vastly different technological world today than those philosophers lived in, we haven't really solved any of those problems. I think what Gray is saying is that we see all of this scientific and technological progress, and so we assume that that means we are advancing as individuals, emotionally, mentally, philosophically, and the latter is not necessarily the case. He says that some of those aspects of society and those aspects of our life are more cyclical. So this is an idea that's talked about a lot in another book, The Fourth Turning. And The Fourth Turning is all about how cycles of history can actually be somewhat predictive about things that are going to change or happen in the future. Obviously, you can't fully predict the future, but certain aspects of human psychology are reactive and go in these loops. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the section on morality. But it's an interesting idea to keep in the back of your mind. Technology, yes, generally moves up and to the right. But does morality, right? Does happiness, do these deeper problems of humanity actually change that much over time? One of the most interesting examples of why this might not be the case is how certain happiness, mental health things seem to get worse in affluent societies, or they can increase as societies get more affluent. There's this really good book called The Drama of the Gifted Child that talks about some of the challenges of being a gifted, affluent kid in the US. And one of those things is that eating disorders, anxiety, depression actually seem to be higher among those students. And why would that be the case? It's something that's kind of interesting to explore, right? It's not a default that as you acquire more resources or more technology, you become a happier, more self-actualized citizen. And I think the reason that Gray talks about this and the reason he wants to drive it home is one of the core ideas he's getting at is this next topic, that we are not that different from animals. Humanism essentially argues that humans and animals are different. Humans have this consciousness, this reasoning, this scientific ability, and we can control our fates. We can make decisions. We are not controlled by our impulses the way animals are. But if you've spent time with humans, you know that's often not the case, right? We're impulsive, reactive all the time. If you've read any of the popular habits books, Atomic Habits, Power of Habit, then you know that a surprisingly high percentage of our behaviors are habit-driven. They're just things we automatically do. And so I kind of agree with Gray here, right? It's hard to say that we are that much better and that much different than animals, aside from a little bit of our ability to think about the future. And he has this interesting point about the relationship between humans and animals historically, like in hunter-gatherer societies, where he says, hunter-gatherers saw their prey as equals, if not superiors, and animals were worshipped as divinities in many traditional cultures. The humanist sense of a gulf between ourselves and other animals is an aberration. For most of human history, we treated animals as gods. They were a core part of our mythology, and for some of the more fearsome predators, we probably did see them as equals or even superiors in some senses. There's some interesting research on kind of the evolution of humanity, especially in Africa, that, and I wish I could remember where I'd read this, but it basically argued that until we got good enough tools, we were basically scavengers. So we could pick the marrow out of bones that were left over from lion kills and things like that. And so we would definitely have seen them as superiors for eating their leftovers. And at that time, we basically had most of the cognitive processes or cognitive abilities that we have today. And so, yes, our tools are much better than animals, but are we at root that different from any other animal? It's an interesting question to consider. There's this other book, and I left it at home. I wish I could show you the cover, but I'll put it here somewhere, called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And what it talks about is how one of the uncomfortable consequences of evolution, or the idea of evolution, is that humans are simply another stepping stone in the change in the species over time. If you accept that, then you also have to recognize that we are simply animals. We don't necessarily have this huge gulf between us and the other creatures of the world. And, that's something that made Darwin deeply uncomfortable in his time period. It made many other people uncomfortable, but we've kind of ignored, or we've kind of forgotten that as we've adopted this idea of human specialness. And a lot of that comes from Judeo-Christian faith that we're going to talk about in a bit. And so Gray goes on, and he has this funny thing about meditation and introspection, where he says, anyone who truly wants to escape human solipsism should not seek out empty places. Instead of fleeing to the desert where they will be thrown back into their own thoughts, they will do better to seek the company of other animals. A zoo is a better window from which to look out of the human world than a monastery. And I think it's interesting that he says zoo. He doesn't say wilderness. I think what he's saying is that we are all sort of trapped in an unnatural environment. Being inside with artificial lighting and recirculated air is not really the environment we're designed to thrive in. And we're not biologically programmed, at least, for 9-to-5 jobs or looking at screens, right? Doing anything that we're doing right now. And so we are kind of living in a human zoo. And so going to a zoo kind of gives you an opportunity to meditate on that. In what ways are we just like other animals living in these little cages? The main difference being they're sort of our own design instead of somebody else's. But this idea of Darwinism when taken seriously, potentially discrediting humanism, kind of brings us to this next topic about the blurry lines between science and faith. By the way, if you're enjoying this, I'm doing one of these every week, so hit subscribe to make sure you get the next one. So are science and faith all that different? One of the things Gray talks about is how these big leaps forward in science would actually not be very scientific by the standards of today. And I'll read you this section from the book. According to the most influential 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper, a theory is scientific only insofar as it is falsifiable, and should be given up as soon as it has been falsified. By this standard, the theories of Darwin and Einstein should never have been accepted. When they were first advanced, each of them was at odds with some available evidence. Only later did evidence become available that gave them crucial support. Applying Popper's account of scientific method would have killed these theories at birth. And then he goes on, the greatest scientists have never been bound by what are now regarded as the rules of scientific method. This is really fascinating because there's almost these like two levels to science. There are these world-changing new theories, right? Newtonian physics, Einstein's relativity, that completely change our understanding of the world. And Gray's point is that in both of those cases, they really weren't actually being scientific. Einstein's original relativity papers are very theoretical, and he had no way to prove them. They were only proved decades later by being able to do some of the tests in space that would confirm his theories. And so if we had actually applied the rules of the scientific method to those theories, they would have somewhat immediately been thrown out. And so these huge advances in science don't necessarily meet the modern standards for science. And then on the flip side, there's a ton of stuff that gets deemed true by science. These could be psychology findings, drug findings, kind of like anything where the scientific method is applied or papers are published that just turn out to be wrong, right? That don't reproduce. There's this growing replication crisis, especially in psychology and decision science, where a lot of things that were said to be like scientific discoveries, facts, whatever, simply aren't true, or at least are rather suspect. And so we like to think that science is this hard, rigid, reliable process for acquiring knowledge that we can say is true, but it's not. And some of those big advances in science don't meet this specific scientific method peer review process that we've established today. And Gray goes on to say that science has kind of filled the void left by us abandoning Christianity, or religion in general. Today, for the mass of humanity, science and technology embody miracle, mystery, and authority. Science promises that the most ancient human fantasies will at last be realized. Sickness and aging will be abolished. Scarcity and poverty will be no more. The species will become immortal. Like Christianity in the past, the modern cult of science lives on the hopes of miracles. And we're definitely seeing this today with advances in technology. And it's very funny to listen to some of these visions of the future seriously, because you'll have people very earnestly argue that, oh, we're going to be able to upload our brains to computers. We're going to be able to modify our bodies to live forever. We're going to achieve immortality through science and computers. And I mean, that's basically just the old immortality myth, but using science instead of religion. And there's not necessarily any more reason to take it seriously, because again, it is just based on a faith that we will figure these things out eventually. That can be deeply uncomfortable for people who are really obsessed with technology and science, but it is just a new religion. It's a new form of faith. But Gray kind of goes on to say that this obsession with immortality, this obsession with science delivering us this paradise that we've always dreamed of, is just another manifestation of the illusion of ourselves. And this is another idea that can be really uncomfortable for people, but I'll read this passage from the book. Our lives are more like fragmentary dreams than the enactment of conscious selves. We control very little of what we most care about. Many of our most fateful decisions are made unbeknownst to ourselves. Yet we insist that mankind can achieve what we cannot, conscious mastery of its existence. This is the creed of those who have given up an irrational belief in God for an irrational faith in mankind. There's this kind of interesting paradox where we have more information than ever about productivity, improving our habits, willpower, self-control, all of these things, but people don't seem any more self-controlled, right? If anything, it's worse, right? We have this growing obesity epidemic. We have so many young people who are just sitting at home playing video games all day. We don't actually have this incredibly self-directed society that you would think we would have if information were actually the problem. And so Gray points out this interesting conundrum, which is we think that humanity can control its destiny, but most individuals can't even control their destiny. How does that make sense? And going back to this topic of the self being an illusion, is there even a self to control or to try to direct? Because there's this interesting idea that we're actually not our best selves when we are conscious of our self. Where other animals differ from humans is in lacking the sensation of selfhood. In this, they are not altogether unfortunate. Self-awareness is as much a disability as a power. The most accomplished pianist is not the one who is most aware of her movements when she plays. The best craftsman may not know how he works. Moving ahead a little bit, in Japan, archers are taught that they will hit the target only when they no longer think of it or themselves. You've definitely been in the zone before or been deeply in a state of flow. And one of the core aspects of that is you sort of forget that you are there. You're no longer looking at yourself. The best version of ourselves is often one that is unaware of itself. And he goes on to say that most of our life is actually done by these unconscious processes that we're very often unaware of, right? We think of ourselves as deliberating what to do, then doing it. But in fact, nearly the whole of our lives, our actions are initiated unconsciously. The brain makes us ready for action, then we have the experience of acting. And then he reads from this research study. The brain evidently decides to initiate, or at the least prepares to initiate, the act at a time before there is any reportable subjective awareness that such a decision has taken place. Cerebral initiation, even of a spontaneous voluntary act, can and usually does begin unconsciously. There have been a bunch of studies on this. Maybe they're reliable, maybe not, right? Going back to the point from before, but they tend to show that our brain decides to do something and then tells our consciousness about it. And so we have this experience of deciding, but we're kind of like a kid riding in the passenger seat with a fake steering wheel, pretending to like turn the car as it turns and thinking that we're driving it. And it ties in with how unreliable our memory is. We've all had the experience of thinking we remember something and it turning out to be false or fabricated or unreliable. I've read one or two things that suggest that when we remember something, we don't remember the event, we remember the last time we remembered it. And so you can easily get into this game of telephone where each time you remember it, little details change. And so memories from a very long time ago are often very unreliable. There's a really good story about Brian Williams, the news anchor, who talked about how a helicopter that he was flying in got shot down in the Middle East. And it turned out to be completely false. He was on a different helicopter that was an hour behind the one that got shot down. He never even had that experience. And it sparked this interesting debate. Malcolm Gladwell had a good podcast where he talked about it, about was he lying or did he just run into the normal fallibility of memory? And Gladwell argued that he was just encountering a normal, unintentional rewriting of memory. And I kind of agree with him because I think that it does happen to all of us. Our memories and our sense of self that is constructed on those memories is not very reliable. Gray has this other great line talking about another writer named Reese, and he says, Reese's life was not a novel, but a collection of short stories, a bundle of sensations linked together by the accidents of memory. It's kind of a nice way to think about yourself over time, is that you are not one person moving in a line through time. You are a collection of short stories of really different persons at different periods of time. And so it's natural to feel some sense of embarrassment or even revulsion at past versions of yourself, and why it's natural to expect that in the future you will become very different people over time as well. Which is the last interesting thought that I'll mention from this section, where Gray questions how much we should even care about our future selves. Why should my future goals matter more than those I have now? It is not just that they are remote, even hypothetical. They may be less worth striving for. Why should a youth suppress his budding passions in favor of the sordid interests of his own withered old age? Why is that problematical old man, who may bear his name 50 years hence, nearer to him now than any other imaginary creature? It's a great way to think about it, right? Like, the future you is this imaginary being who will never exist in the way you're imagining them. So to what extent should you care about them? Obviously, I think there are certain ways you should try to keep yourself healthy, not take up smoking or hard drugs or anything, but how much do you need to save and design your life around creating the best life possible for that person versus giving yourself the best life possible now? It's an interesting question to think about, at least. But then talking about the challenges of predicting the future, let's move on to the cycles of morality. Because another thing Gray argues in the book is that morality in particular is cyclical over time. It does not move in a line. Gray expands on that common meme about how strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men. And he talks about how that is probably a more accurate interpretation of how morality changes throughout history. Humans thrive in conditions that morality condemns. The peace and prosperity of one generation stands on the injustices of earlier generations. The delicate sensibilities of liberal societies are fruits of war and empire. Gentleness flourishes in sheltered lives. An instinctive trust in others is rarely strong in people who have struggled against the odds. The qualities we say we value above all others cannot withstand ordinary life. And then he takes this interesting detour about how we used to resolve some of these struggles with morality through faith in like a Judeo-Christian sense. But when we replaced that with science and progress as the dominant religions, it created this problem with recognizing how unhappy a lot of people are today. He says that drug use is a tacit admission of a forbidden truth. For most people, happiness is beyond reach. Fulfillment is found not in daily life, but in escaping from it. And since happiness is unavailable, the mass of mankind seeks pleasure. Religious cultures could admit that earthly life was hard, for they promised another one in which all tears would be wiped away. Their humanist successors affirm something still more incredible, that in the future, even the near future, everyone can be happy. Societies founded on a faith in progress cannot admit the normal unhappiness of human life. As a result, they are bound to wage war on those who seek an artificial happiness in drugs. We used to be able to accept a certain amount of unhappiness or struggle in life because there was this belief in being delivered to a much happier life afterwards. But once that belief went away and got replaced by this faith in progress, this belief that the world should be or can be perfect now, we don't have that same justification for being unhappy, which Gray argues is why there's such a stronger trend towards drugs, diversion, a life of kind of escapism. But he also argues that that could actually lead us back to a stronger morality. And we're already seeing some of this now. He says, how will satiety and idleness be staved off when designer sex, drugs, and violence no longer sell? At that point, we may be sure morality will come back into fashion. We may not be far off from a time when morality is marketed as a new brand of transgression. I love that line because I feel like we're already starting to see this today. Religion is kind of becoming cool, or it's becoming like interesting, but in a way that some people are embarrassed to talk about with some of their more secular friends. So I think Gray is right that this broad spanning kind of a hopelessness or sense of uselessness that we're going to touch on in a minute is actually bringing us back maybe to a world of a stronger morality again, maybe a faith-based one. But one of the big resistances to faith and a more religious life is this modern obsession with control, because we are obsessed with control and freedom. As Gray says in the book, for us, nothing is more important than to live as we choose. This is not because we value freedom more than people did in earlier times. It is because we have identified the good life with the chosen life. Choice, control, freedom are kind of the new godly virtues of today. We see that as the good life, the ideal life is one freedom from constraints or freedom from having to live in a way that we don't want to live. And as long as you're obsessed with control and freedom, you're unwilling to accept a world where you might not have that control over your life. And this obsession with goals and control actually blocks us from really enjoying the world around us. He says, the common man cannot see things objectively because his mind is clouded by anxiety about achieving his goals. For people enthralled to morality, in the modern humanist sense, the good life means perpetual striving. And he compares that with the Taoists, where he says, for Taoists, it means living effortlessly according to our natures. The freest human being is not one who acts on reasons he has chosen for himself, but one who never has to choose. And that's a very strange life for us to consider, one where you're not trying to control your choices, but you're just fixated on living naturally in the moment. It's completely the opposite of what most of us try to optimize around. But it might actually be a happier life. Gray goes on to say, humans think they are free, conscious beings when in truth they are deluded animals. At the same time, they never cease trying to escape from what they imagine themselves to be. Their religions are attempts to be rid of a freedom they have never possessed. In the 20th century, the utopias of right and left served the same function. Today, when politics is unconvincing even as entertainment, science has taken on the role of mankind's deliverer. So we imagine ourselves as these rational, free-thinking, controlling agents, this humanist philosophy, but that degree of control over our lives is kind of terrifying. And so we would rather somebody tell us what to do, tell us what to think, tell us what to believe, because that much control is scary. But Gray is saying that the solution isn't to turn to faith or turn to science or turn to some influencer or whatever to tell you how to live. It's to recognize that we never had that control in the first place. It's to live more like the Taoists of just trying to be authentically in the present moment instead of trying to change and control it. And there's something really funny here about the modern idea of meditation and the popularity of meditation, where it's really treated like a means to an end. You meditate so that you can be less anxious, so that you can be more productive, so that you can control your errant thoughts. And that's really not what the point of contemplation should be, at least according to Gray. He says, contemplation is not the willed stillness of the mystics, but a willing surrender to never returning moments. When we turn away from our all too human yearnings, we turn back to mortal things. Not moral hopes or mystical dreams, but groundless facts are the true objects of contemplation. Our goal in silence or being in nature, meditating, whatever, shouldn't be to go back to work a better person. It should be to realize that that's really all there is, are these never returning moments. The more we try to escape from them or control them, the more we deny ourselves the happiness we could be experiencing in the present moment. But instead of learning to see, as Gray describes, we tend to turn ourselves over to distractions because we are terrified that we are useless. So in The Denial of Death, which is another book I've talked about a lot, Ernest Becker talks about how so many of our actions and motivations are driven by this fear and this desire to escape from our own mortality. We would rather build pyramids than confront the limits of our life. We want to try to create things that will live forever. Gray kind of takes another turn or another look at that by saying that we're also highly motivated by our fear of uselessness. And this is one of my favorite passages from the book. I sent this to a bunch of people when I read it. Many trends in industrial societies lead to a future where humans are supported by machines as our ancestors were by wildlife. But that does not mean mass employment. Rather, we are approaching a time when almost all humans work to amuse other humans. In rich countries, that time has already arrived. Here we are, right? The old industries have been exported to the developing world. At home, new occupations have evolved, replacing those of the industrial era. Many of them satisfying needs that in the past were repressed or disguised. A thriving economy of psychotherapists, designer religions, and spiritual boutiques has sprung up. Beyond that, there is an enormous gray economy of illegal industries supplying drugs and sex. The function of this new economy, legal and illegal, is to entertain and distract a population which, though it is busier than ever before, secretly suspects that it is useless. When we feel useless and like we have no control over our lives, we tune out. We try to avoid confronting that. We turn to drugs, video games, porn, distraction, anything, because in a society where your productivity and your output and your control are kind of the main good, idleness is a sin. It's something we feel guilty about. And this wasn't as much of a problem until the more modern era where a lot of people can theoretically not work. Only, 1% of the US at least needs to do the farming for the whole country to have enough food. And if you're out in the field working to feed yourself, you're not wondering if your daily work is useless. But if you're moving around numbers in a spreadsheet or creating PowerPoints, you might start to question if you're actually doing anything that meaningful. And for a lot of people, they react very negatively to that. They feel very useless, and so they turn to these various distractions to cope with that feeling. But there's this other big form of escapism that a lot of us turn to, which is we use action and productivity as a form of escapism. This is actually from the intro. If the hope of progress is an illusion, how are we to live? The question assumes that humans can live well only if they believe they have the power to remake the world. Yet most humans who have ever lived have not believed this, and a great many have had happy lives. The question assumes the aim of life is action, but this is a modern heresy. For Plato, contemplation was the highest form of human activity. A similar view existed in ancient India. The aim of life was not to change the world. It was to see it rightly. What I think Gray is getting at is that we're incapable of just sitting and viewing the world, and so we obsess over action and control as a way to escape from confronting this potential feeling of uselessness or the limits of our life, this lack of meaning in our day-to-day existence. And he brings in the myth of Sisyphus a lot here. And Sisyphus was somebody who defied the gods to help mankind, and his punishment was that for all of eternity, he would have to push this boulder up a hill, at which point it would roll back down to the other side. He would have to push it up again, and he would keep doing that forever. One of the things Gray is kind of arguing here is that most of us are like Sisyphus. We are doing ultimately pointless work over and over again because we would rather keep pushing the boulder than just sit and look at it. It's interesting that, at least in the US, a lot of the richest people also work the hardest. We don't have this leisure class anymore where once you got rich, you would just kind of like stop working and hang out. You just work harder and try to get more and more. And it hints at this idea that we're using action and productivity to avoid confronting challenging truths about our lives and ourselves. One thing he mentions here is that nothing is more alien to the present age than idleness. If we think of resting from our labors, it is only in order to return to them. How often have you heard this? Right? You come back from the weekend refreshed for work. You need a vacation to recharge, right? Everything that we do to relax is centered around improving our productivity during work time. The idleness is serving the work, when really, I think we would prefer that our work serves our idleness, right? The goal of life is not one where you keep pushing the boulder. It's one where you can put the boulder down and go play with your kids. But when we think of idleness and rest and relaxation as serving the work, then we're in this pure work as escapism and focus mentality. And Gray points out that for the ancients, unending labor was the mark of a slave. The labors of Sisyphus are a punishment. In working for progress, we submit to a labor no less servile. And he highlights really well that we can't even play and relax anymore. How can there be play in a time where nothing has meaning unless it leads to something else? In our eyes, people who play live a life without purpose. Since play is beyond us, we have given ourselves over to a life of purposeless work instead. To labor as Sisyphus does is our fate. And a good example of this is how kids don't really play anymore. They're in these highly programmed like music classes or sports leagues or dance organizations, right? Like they can't just go do those things for fun. They have to be progressing through like a hierarchy of skill and ability so they can put it on their college transcript and all of that, right? Like they can't just go enjoy being a kid anymore. And that's really sad. Going back to this idea that the work should serve the idleness, the work should serve the play too. And we should be able to do things that have no point because life kind of has no point, at least in Gray's argument. And I think what Gray is suggesting too is that if we accept that life is ultimately kind of meaningless and pointless in the grand cosmic sense, if we accept that we have a lot less control over our fate than we think, and that we are just kind of animals in a zoo in some ways, then we can play guilt-free. We can enjoy our life. We can be in the present moment and try to see life for what it is instead of constantly trying to control the environment around us. And I'll leave you with the last line of the book where he says, "Other animals do not need a purpose in life. A contradiction to itself, the human animal cannot do without one. Can we not think of the aim of life as being simply to see?" If you thought any of those ideas were interesting, definitely grab Straw Dogs by John Gray. Really, really fantastic book. There's so much more than I was able to cover in this. If you enjoyed this, I'm releasing a new one every week, so please hit subscribe to make sure you get the next one. And you might also enjoy this video over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.